Thank you, Bogie. So opening the event is the director of our research centre, Professor Antonio Bifolco, and over to you, Tony.
Okay, thank you. Okay, we're being recorded again, good. So welcome everyone to our webinar on invisible risks, combating secondary trauma to safeguard children. We're delighted you can join us and pleased at the numbers attending to hear the latest research on this, what we think is an important topic. We're grateful to Beglarka Megisvarvi for organising the event and for Luca D'Angelo for technical support. We hope everything goes smoothly. So I am a professor of lifespan psychology and director of the Centre for Abuse and Trauma Studies, or CATS, which is hosting this. And our centre combines sort of psychology and criminology research with a focus on harms to children and its wider impacts, including for those professionals who work in child protection and may be susceptible to secondary trauma themselves. Amongst such professionals, we would count content moderators, and these are often overlooked as critical in monitoring child abuse images. And they also are prone to such impacts. Such work can take great personal toll. And today we'll share with you our early findings from our content moderator study, and you'll hear from members of our team. You've already met our Associate Director, Dr. Elena Martellozzo, who will chair, and then Dr. Paul Blakely will moderate the Q&A session. Two presentations from our team on the study will be Dr. Ruth Spence, psychologist, and Paula Bradbury, criminologist, who will present the quantitative and qualitative findings. And I will then conclude. And I've also notes and points made by Associate Director Dr. Jeffrey DeMarco, who unfortunately can't be with us. We're really delighted to have additional expert speakers with a wealth of experience on the role of content moderators and its challenges. From psychiatry, we have Dr. Richard Graham, from InHope, Denton Howard, and from online safety, Andy Briarcliffe. They will provide context and understanding of content moderators' role and importance, as well as the challenges these workers face day to day. I hope you'll find the webinar interesting, instructive, and a driver for positive change. I hand over to you now, Elena.
Thank you, Tony, and welcome again. I'd like to highlight that this is an independent study conducted obviously by our wonderful CATS team, funded by the Tech Coalition and End Violence. And I was looking at the people registered for this event, and I saw more than 150 participants from 24 countries, which is just wonderful. So it shows how important this topic is and how much interest there is in child protection. I think we all know that online child sexual abuse material is highly damaging to children, but it's also damaging to those that work in child protection, like content moderators. The role of these content moderators involve the removal of online child sexual abuse, hence the kind of invisible risks. And this constant surveillance of traumatic images can affect their well-being, their mental health, the quality of life, as well as the work, their work and their satisfaction and productivity and competence as well at some point of their work life. So when we put this proposal together, nearly now 2 years ago, we strongly felt that there was something missing, that something needed to be done to really support content moderators and to help them cope with the work that they do each day. So we spent the past 2 years exploring and quantifying the issues faced by content moderators in doing their work and understanding their experiences, in order to develop at the end an intervention that is designed specifically for them. So in today's webinar, the team will present the findings, and as Tony said, but before they do so, I would like to introduce our guest speakers. And I'd like to start with our friend, our child psychiatrist, Dr. Richard Graham, who's been supporting positive mental health in children and young people for years. Richard has also been our critical friend, our external advisor, and one of the supporting pillars for this project. And now I'm going to quote you, Richard, I hope you don't mind. In one of your posts, you said, "The understanding the impact of the work upon content moderators may have come late, but it's never too late to make the changes, because we need these professionals to be able to do their work well and to flourish." So over to you, Richard, now.
Apologies for that. Yes, after 3 years into a pandemic, I still am on mute. Thank you, Eleanor, and thank you, Tony, for such important words, really introducing what feels to me a really significant event in terms of not just understanding the work of content moderators, but really thinking about the time we've all been living through, we've all been immersed in, the way we're living differently, working differently, relating to each other differently, and how we really need to be thinking about how we respond to some of the challenges, as well as embracing those opportunities. So if we go to the first slide, I found myself in relation to this event and the research findings, thinking about a book that Klaus Schwab published, I think 6 years ago now, really emphasizing that we were living through an industrial revolution. And I think we often don't take time. Can make a lot of magical and fantastic, but there are also other aspects. And if we go back to the first industrial revolution, so 250 years or so, as people were moving from living in farms to living in cities, there were all sorts of opportunities. There was this phrase, you know, the industrialization made Britain rich, but it also made Britain sick. And so unintended or unknown sort of risks and consequences sort of arose out of that, including the spread of disease, because people were living close together, such as smallpox, typhus, tuberculosis, because people were living closer together in crowded streets, very different from living in farm spaces where with greater space. And that impact was such that by the mid-18th century, average life expectancy was 36. And I'm just flagging this not to suggest by any means we're in quite that same or post-pandemic perhaps state, but actually things about how we were living, how we were working, etc., did bring unanticipated risks. And I think what we're starting to do is perhaps starting to acknowledge what those might be in the digital revolution. If we go to the next slide, and of course, one of the things that Eleanor has spoken about is we are terribly reliant on those that develop the products, that fund them, that of course keep the spaces safe if they're social spaces, remove those harmful content pieces that can be so distressing to witness, and yet often not really thinking beyond the end user often, and what impact that is having on those that are charged with taking those pieces of content down, stopping those aggressive or coercive interactions. If we go to the next slide, sorry, you know, we are, I think, being asked all to consider in terms of how we do maintain the digital world in a safe space, what we want from those developing, running the organizations, the companies that produce digital technologies. And the Online Safety Bill, you know, has lots of statements, but interestingly, to my mind, very little consideration in a realistic way of what that's going to mean. And that's not to let anyone sort of off the hook in terms of the importance of that, but actually to acknowledge that this needs to be properly supported and funded. And so here's a quote from the Telegraph of just a sheer level of pressure moderators may be under to sort of review, and reviewing content, if you have ever been charged with that, is not an easy task. It's complex, it's subtle. Policy guidelines take you so far, but often judgment, critical thinking is absolutely key, but also then delivering that at speed. If we go to the next slide, then what I guess we're all hoping to do in supporting those who are moderating content, working in the tech sector, is recognize that there are ordinary stresses in the work. There is going to be sort of that level of pressure that is part of the work, as it would be in safeguarding work or frontline workers in other areas. And to be able to function and be sort of able to undertake that work, we want to stop them sort of moving from that area of stress to chronic stress and then worse burnout, and finally sort of avoid post-traumatic stress disorder, and also that element of post-traumatic stress, moral injury, where something is personally offending to the individual and particularly adds a particular complexity to recovering from traumatic stress. So what we're hoping to do is stay more down at that ordinary stress end, where we're able to function, live well and flourish. If we go to the next slide, I think it's worth reflecting on some of our understanding from occupational health and particularly the concept of burnout, that some of what we're witnessing has also occurred before. And I'm very keen to sort of make sure elements like stress and burnout are also in our consideration of how we're supporting people. And one of the first examples came from air traffic controllers in the 1960s and 70s, where there was this wealth of growth of international travel, and the air traffic controllers were trying to respond to that with inadequate equipment, changing shift patterns, long shifts without breaks, stress and fatigue of those long shifts, the monotony of lots of automated work, and then the challenges arising from using technology. Never underestimate that. And because that was not anticipated and responded to in a timely fashion, very good people burnt out, and tragically there were mid-air collisions. And I think some of what we need to be thinking about is, when we're looking at harms in the online world, are we looking after the people and supporting them enough to be able to undertake that important work? Because there may not be mid-air collisions, but there are harms that endure. So if we go to the next slide, there's going to be a wealth of really important insights to absorb today. But I do, from an occupational health perspective, think we also need to consider all those aspects of supporting someone in their work that can protect you from chronic stress and burnout and traumatic stress. So where you're working, so moderators can be working from home across the globe with a dispersed workforce, often feeling isolated from how effective they are in their work and needing feedback, which, you know, say in the health sector, we will often get from people expressing gratitude or sometimes not for the support they've had. There's that interface with the technology and keeping abreast of developments, perhaps feeling under threat that AI is going to replace you, but then having to be exposed to distressing content and conduct, and some of the subtle things of how people behave online, you know, in a bullying capacity or discriminatory capacity, can often be as distressing as more extreme content. And then making complex decisions at speed, perhaps in a service, if one looks at a platform like TikTok, which, you know, was escalating to billions of users over a very short space of time, with all the content being created that comes with that. So I think keeping in mind all of this complexity will help us also empathize and find better solutions. And today is a really good step down that road. If we go finally to the last sort of points I'd want to make, really, I certainly feel in my work with moderators over the years that I just respect that this is a highly skilled, stressful occupation, and really needs to be recognized as such, and really as a profession. Done well, it's so skilled, so important. And really our future online world is dependent on our ability to support them, because if we start looking always for technical solutions, we're going to limit some of our understanding of complexity, and that will impact on us as end users. It does need to be properly resourced and supported both by industry and investors. So we need that whole funding cycle to be considered in terms of really building in proper resources that respect those skilled workers, but also understood by regulators and politicians. You know, it's not magic taking distressing extreme content down. It involves people doing work that needs to properly be grasped. But I also think from my own world of health, we also need occupational health and clinical services that also must advance to understanding now we don't go online, we are online and working online, etc. And perhaps our models of mental health, of mental disorder even, have to really adjust, as we saw public health developed in the first industrial revolution. Understanding infection and good public health really led to developments in clinical services as well. So this is an opportunity for everyone, but absolutely based on that empathy, perhaps sympathy for those working in this space. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you also for revisiting the history, because this is not new. We're not facing a new problem, and certainly we have seen this happening, this kind of needing for support in the past. Thank you for that. Our next speaker is Denton Howard, Executive Director of the InHope. Everybody knows Denton in the child protection area, with whom he's been working since 2005. It's a great honor to have Denton here, because he's been advocating this project since its very inception. In fact, I remember Jeffrey and I went to Denton to say to him and ask, what do you think? Do you think this is a good idea? And he was like, yeah, go for it. Absolutely. And we were successful in the funding. Denton is passionate about combating online child sexual abuse, and he's here to talk about his role at the InHope and the role of counter moderators. Over to you, Denton.
Well, Eleanor, thank you very much for that challenging introduction. I'm not sure, I feel a little intimidated now. A bit of imposter syndrome kicking in. So if there's a psychologist in the room, I'd appreciate some support. So basically, let me introduce myself for the people who don't know me. My name is Denton Howard. I am the Executive Director of InHope, which is a scary title because it generally means everything is my fault, okay? But just, if we could just jump on to the next slide, because we'll get to all that stuff later on. So, well, as I just said my name, but as Eleanor alluded to, I worked in this field by accident, which I think most people end up in it, in 2005 to do a 3-week project, which evolved into 3 months, which evolved into 3 years, which evolved into where we are today in 2023. I fell into this knowing nothing about this field, with a group of people who knew nothing about it, but who collectively we have a very high level of commitment, which sort of has evolved. And I have the great pleasure of leading an organization which is spread over 50 countries, with 46 countries with 50 hotlines. But it will hopefully be 50 countries watch this space in the next 4 months, who have a sort of we have a collective view and a common vision and mission, which is to combat child sexual abuse material. But that in itself is a thing of how do we do it? And that's kind of, I want to talk to you about today, about the people that do it. And you have to talk, we have to really get into the nitty gritty. But before I get into that, I just want to quickly talk about the, well, I'm going to talk about the 2 dogs that have decided to go crazy in the next room. So I hope they're not blotting out my speaking. But this project, Eleanor alluded to it in terms of when Eleanor came to me and said, what do you think? And I went, absolutely. But when it was awarded, I was delighted because the awarding bodies are through the Tech Coalition and EVAC, and they're all partners of ours. So there's a lot of common ground. But specifically about the topic of today is the trauma from viewing CSAM. Within our network, we currently, as of this morning, we have 268 active analysts across the world. And that varies every week. It goes up a little bit, 1 or 2, goes up by 1 or 2, drops by 1 or 2, people move on. But they are what we call the engine room. If anybody's into Star Trek, they're the Scotty in the engine room. They're the people who make it happen. We're technology driven. Well, the perception is we're technology driven, and there is lots of fancy machines that do that. But behind that are the people. And unless we take care of the people, the machines won't work and we won't achieve what we're supposed to do. So with that, I want to quickly talk to you about, for the people that don't know, a hotline is a place where the public will have a place to report anonymously child abuse material, or in other cases, illegal materials that they think are illegal. The hotline will assess that, and then they will take action depending on the country that they're in. So if in country A it's illegal, they will take action to get it removed as rapidly as possible. Equally, if it's not in that country, it's in country B, they will, using our infrastructure, get that report transferred to the relevant country, and we get the content removed. We have in the background a stopwatch, which is constantly going, and it starts when the report is received, and it only ends when a piece of content is removed. And that's how we measure our success. And it's the people behind it that actually make that happen. So I just want to stress that point. And equally, if you want any more information, please go to www.inhope.org, and you'll find everything you want to know. But equally, I'm probably the easiest person in the world to find. If you want more information, please contact me directly. So back to really what I want to talk to you about today. If I could move on to the next slide, please. As I mentioned, we're basically powered by people, okay? The computers are in the background, but it's the people who drive that process. And the analysts, they come from a super variety of backgrounds. They come from like technical backgrounds, psychological backgrounds, educational backgrounds, bin collector backgrounds. You wouldn't believe the different in diversity. And that diversity gives us a lot of strength because it also stops groupthink, okay? People are open to ideas, open to suggestions. So we have people with PhDs and we have people with don't even have a high school education, okay? And that huge spectrum, that brings such a wealth of experience and knowledge. So because there is a danger of over-intellectualizing things. And I hate to offend you. I know there's lots of doctors in this room, so please don't be offended by me saying that. But it's really, really important. So analysts, they look at the content, they make the decisions. They're the people who put in the cultural context of what is or is in different countries, what would be a minor in terms of physiology, all of that kind of thing. A lot of that only comes from local knowledge, from experience. But they're human beings, okay? We use the term, and it was said by accident a number of years ago, analysts are digital first responders. So when there's a fire in the fire brigade or the ambulance gets called, they're the first responders. When something bad is found online, they are the digital responders. And that's really important. And if you could move on to the next slide, you'll see why, okay? Because they're exposed to things that none of us should be exposed to. I'm sure there are some people in this room, virtual room, sitting in the sky in the cloud, that have been involved in child abuse material. But believe me, it's something you, no matter how used you get to it, you don't want to be around it. And we use the analogy of it being the nuclear waste of the internet. So just like that, with nuclear waste, you have to manage the exposure, or else you start to glow in the dark, and then you explode. Okay. And an exploded analyst is no good to anybody. It's no good to them. It's no good to their family. It's no good to the hotline. It's no good to the victims. Okay. And it's also the wrong thing to do. So we have a process of mitigation and exposure management. And then we have a wellness program, which I'll get into in a second. So it's really important to remember that we are dealing with things you do not want to be around for, or well, people have to be around it, but you should manage that and you should caution it. Again, I'm going to defer to I was very impressed by Richard's presentation earlier on, and he alluded to a number of things. I was saying he's stealing my glory, but in a good possible way. If I could have the next slide, please. So really what we have to do is we have to protect what we say, the protectors, because everybody who gets into this wants it for the best reason, because nobody in my world does this for the money. We could all do a lot better doing something else, okay? So it's important that we have to take care of people, because aside from being the right thing to do, it takes a long time to train somebody. That experience is invaluable. And so we have a program that we require all the hotlines to implement, and we do training, we do online supports, we have support groups, we require people to have counseling on a regular basis, we require staff wellness programs to be maintained. And these are all very good, but they're really important because the result is we have about a 2% labor turnover, which in any industry per annum is practically none, okay? So we're either the best employers in the whole world, or we basically go on too much and protect people too well and treat them too well. But in reality, it's people are very committed. So if I could have the next slide, please. So how do, no, come back. Yeah, there we go. So how do we do that? Okay. Now, I'm not going to read out to you because that's not the purpose of today. My point is just to make a couple of impacts. We publish a lot of information of what we do. Okay. And there's a link on that slide, which understands the work, and it's part 1, and then it leads to part 2. But the most important statement here is we have found is it's okay not to be okay. And that honesty and that one statement in an abuse team is the most powerful thing, because when people have a problem shared, it's a problem halved. So please bear that one in mind. Peer discussions, peer meetings, professional support, having a varied work pattern, Tetris, using computer games to avoid traumatic memory laydown at the end of a business day. Some hotlines, we have a 30-minute cool down period where they must do something else before they leave the office. Then we get into triage. How do you minimize the impact? Okay, well, what about AI is always the big thing. And if you can move on to the next slide, please. Well, AI is a very useful thing. It is a little scary sometimes, depending on how you think about it, but it's very useful because there are a lot of tools which can triage and manage the cues or manage the volumes to focus the analyst's attention on the things that are truly important and urgent, and then degrade the ones maybe that aren't as urgent. There's a lot of things coming down the line within AI, and specifically Google's classification AI. They announced on last Tuesday at an event I was at that they will now work with video. Prior to this, only worked with static images. Those will have quite a large impact in terms of how we will succeed in what we do. And by we, I mean we as a collective community. So, as I say, it can only do so much because there's also hashing, which can take away a lot of the workload. All of those fancy technologies, let's see what they can do. But what I can say is to be awareness of the difficulties and challenges. And if you could go to the final slide, please. I want to leave it the last statement that it is not, or it's okay not to be okay, but it's important to keep smiling. And with that, I'll hand you back to Elena, and thank you very much for today.
Thank you, Denton. It's good to end in a positive note. It's challenging discussing these issues, and particularly the type of exposure that content moderators are dealing with on the day-to-day basis, and not forgetting that AI, although it's a very fashionable term, it's it doesn't resolve the issue. We still need people behind the screen to protect us from what we could or might be exposed. Thank you. So our next speaker is Andy Briarcliffe, who we met during this research. Doing research is challenging, particularly if you're researching around child protection and online abuse. But the wonder of research is also that you make a lot of friends during the journey. And Andy was one of this. And he's an online child safety specialist who has spent over 20 years in UK law enforcement, undertaking investigation and intelligence work concerning various types of crimes, including online child abuse. He's also passionate about content moderation, and when we shared with him our project, he participated, took part, and today is here to join our webinar. Over to you, Andy.
Thank you. Well, firstly, I'd like to say thank you, Eleanor and Middlesex University, for asking me to speak today. I'd also like to say how privileged I am being in the company of the other speakers who have been absolutely fascinating so far. But most importantly, I just want to say how humbled I am to be amongst all the audience here today, because I know what you do. I've been there, I've seen it, I've watched it, I've read it, and to be honest, you're all under-recognized for what you have to deal with. We're looking at the worst of the worst content a lot of the time, and you're doing amazing stuff. So like you, I've done many years of tackling online harm, predominantly CSE and CSAM, but also dealt with suicide, self-harm, gore, graphic, everything you can imagine. And we all do it for several hours a day, 5, maybe 6, maybe even 7 days a week, not quite 52 weeks a year, because hopefully you all get a bit of leave or PTO, but that is an awful lot of time to be doing this. And throughout that time you see a lot of stuff. I mean, it wasn't unusual to see several thousand images a day, which is not really the normal thing for anybody to be seeing. So I've seen it, I've done it, I understand what we all go through. Next slide, please. So my first thing is actually, who are content moderators? And I think there's a bit of a misconception that content moderators are usually the people who are in the outsourced companies from the big platforms. But actually, I would say all of these people here would, in theory, be classed as content moderators, because I would say it's anybody who's actually reviewing harmful content. Some people is it allowed on the platform? Is it not? Is it breach of the terms of service? Is it reportable, or is it just to be removed? Is it allowed in one country, not another? And if you're law enforcement, are you classifying it as illegal or non-illegal? We obviously have the hotline people who are fantastic as well. So maybe the word content moderators to describe us all maybe isn't quite right. Should we be harmful content specialists? Maybe that's something to be discussed. But all these people do the job of moderating content in one way, and we are all looking at this horrible stuff. Next slide, please. Yeah, so it says what it is there. Everybody who's doing this job, you are all absolutely amazing. You are all awesome. You are all superheroes. And I think, to be honest, we work in the shadows. The public sort of know we exist, and there are people who are doing this type of work, but it's never really discussed, actually. And when you're talking to people, I've had this where I've tried to explain my job to people, and they've turned around and said, well, you don't actually see anything, do you? And when you turn around and go, yes, they seem a bit shocked, and you think, well, what do you think I actually do? So you are all awesome. Give yourselves a pat on the back. You're absolutely fantastic. Next slide, please. So I was just going to mention this about the brain function and media versus text. Okay. And so if we go to the next slide, sorry. So if you're looking at a piece of media, and whether that be a video or actually an image, your brain will see that straight away. So search on this slide here, you can all see a TV. Your brain knew that was a TV without even thinking. Okay. And it's the same with media. You look at something, and if you've been in this job long enough, you'll immediately know it's either CSAM or it's graphic gore. You don't really have to think about it sometimes. However, next slide, please. If you're then looking at text and you're reading a really graphic text conversation, your brain will start painting a picture of that. So here, with the word car, I would probably guarantee, majority of you maybe, your brain has automatically put an image of a car in your head. And this is something we have to be careful of. When we're having to read these stories or conversations, of some of the bad stuff, we have to be conscious that our brain is going to start making these images and putting that in the forefront of our head. Okay. Next slide, please. So with the text, sorry, just going back to the media there, we have the tech to blur, thanks. We have the tech to blur out images. We have the tech to prioritize it, move it to one side so we don't necessarily have to see the worst of the worst. But with text, it is slightly different. So whether we're looking at media, whether we're looking at text, we have to be careful of the risks, as it's been mentioned previously. You know, we talk about the burnout, the stress, the physical and mental well-being and how it affects us. You know, it can drain us physically. We can become unbelievably tired. It's not just necessarily mental health. And it has been discussed that for many or for content moderators doing this type of work, especially in the CSE arena, it can actually affect how you think sexually as well. And that's a strange thing to say, but it can either increase a sex drive, minimize a sex drive, or make you think about sexual activity in a different way. And we have to be conscious of that. And also desensitivity. We get so blasé maybe about seeing some of the stuff we see, such as naked selfies of teenagers. If you're talking to someone and go, oh, you know, oh, teenagers, I wish they'd stop sending naked selfies. To us, we see that all the time. But you say that to a member of the public or, you know, your friends, they might be, what? Hey, what's going on? So we build up this desensitivity to it all. And also, we take a different perspective on the world. We can be out in town and we spot people acting in different ways. You know, maybe how people are acting around children, or if we walk, if we're near, like, I don't know, a playground, we might start looking at different things. You know, do we, you know, a lot of people look at the world in an innocent manner, but because of what we do, are we looking at the dangers all the time? And obviously it can also put us on edge and bring out anger, you know, because of what we've seen. It can create this feeling of anxiety and anger towards how people treat others. So we have to be careful of being on edge and how it affects us as well. Next slide, please. So when it comes to coping mechanisms, there isn't one size that fits everybody. We all react and deal with things in a different way. What will affect one person might not affect another. For instance, I used to work with someone who could look at the CSE stuff, but as soon as they saw feet, really did not like it, okay? And somebody else had to deal with it. So we all have our different things. And the thing is, we don't necessarily know our triggers until it happens, you know, and we don't know when that will happen. So we have to be aware of it. However, there is one coping strategy that everybody can do, and that is just talking to each other. You know, there's not many people we can talk to about what we do and what we see. And it's only people who are doing the job can truly understand really what we're seeing. And, you know, I can't describe it to you now necessarily because I'd have to give you a content warning. But if I was to say to someone, oh, I saw this today, the only people who would truly understand what I've seen are people like you, you know, and that's where we need to come together, whether it's your colleagues, maybe it's your managers, you know, maybe you need to get a group together and you can all share and talk about this sort of stuff. But talking, as Denton's just said, it's okay not to be okay. There's no need to put on a front. You know, it is super important to talk to each other and to share your thoughts and feelings. Next slide, please. And the other thing is coping mechanisms. We all have our different ways. You know, some of us all have pets. You know, you might be a dog person, you might be a cat person. Dogs are better than cats, just like I point that out. But, you know, you might have fish or whatever. That suits some people. Some people don't like animals. Some people like to go to the gym or exercise. Again, it's not for everybody. You just need to find what suits you. Okay, everybody's different. And, you know, you find your happy place, if you like, the way to get away from it all. You know, and we have to accept that everybody's different and they all have different coping mechanisms. But again, it's back to the most important mechanism is talking to each other, sharing how we feel, you know, and learning from each other. Next slide, please. But there are some ongoing risks. And one of those is what happens when we just stop doing this. And we're probably all acutely aware recently of all the mass tech layoffs that have happened. Thousands of people who have probably been doing this work. So what happens, you know, whilst we're in that job, we do have the backing, we do have the support, we can speak to psychiatrists and doctors and therapists and go for our lovely coffee breaks, you know, but when that stops, where do we go? You know, and the other problem being is, you know, it gives us time to think. It gives us time to maybe have that brain relapse about what we've been doing, what we've been seeing, you know, and we've all potentially already going through a lot of stress as well, you know, being laid off, or, you know, what am I going to do with my life now? And all that together can exaggerate our thoughts and the processes of what we've seen. So we need to really look at the PTSD side of things. You know, we're aware of the soldiers who see traumatic stuff, and we've heard, you know, and read a lot about how they suffer PTSD. Firefighters as well, medical people in A&Es. There's a big thing that all these people can suffer PTSD, and there's a lot of support around for them, but there's not so much for people like us. So we need to start looking after at the aftercare. You know, how do we support people when we stop? You know, should companies be providing something afterwards? Well, I don't know. I'm going to give you an example of this. That I had a friend, he was in law enforcement, and he had done a wide variety of law enforcement jobs. A real tough person, and he worked with me doing a lot of CSE related stuff, and they decided to go for promotion, which is great. And that promotion led them to, I'm going to call it a mundane job. Everything's mundane compared to what we do here. And they went to this mundane job, and because of the pace of that job slowed down, it was that actually caused them to have flashbacks and caused them to have PTSD. And the problem was that, well, apart from that being the problem itself, because they had actually then left that environment of the job, there was no support. And they had to actually fight to get that support. And I think that's something that we really need to look at going forward about people who do this job. Next slide, please. So that's me. Thank you very much. Please feel free to reach out. But most importantly, to all of you, just keep up doing the amazing job you're all doing. As I say, I've been there, I've seen it, I've done it. I know what you all deal with. So keep it up. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andy. Thank you so much for sharing your experience. It was so important for us to really bring the voice to this room and to hear, you know, from someone that has done the work, how it's like, how do you feel? And also some of your advice and tips is exactly also what other content moderators shared during this research. So thank you. We have a few minutes for questions and answer, if that's okay. We have some interesting questions from the audience, if I may. So I'm going to read one, and I think this is probably for you, Denton, to address if you have an answer. And it's, what advice could you give for moderators who are facing harassment or abuse for removing content or sharing content that user object to? So, you know, if you get harassed by stopping someone to share content, how would you respond? Just go to Denton.
Well, how did I know I was going to be first? Okay, so this is like, okay. But anyhow, on a serious note, Well, to be honest with you, we have processes and procedures which basically protect the anonymity of an analyst, because in other words, an analyst's name never gets associated with any activity. But we have had situations of an intimidation by people. I won't get into specific incidents, but sort of our approach is to use the full rigor of the law and go straight back at them. Okay, that in other words, professionalism, not shrinking violence, not to be intimidated by it. You're doing the right thing for the right reasons, and by no means should anybody feel any way inadequate to that. Okay, and should make no excuses and no allowances for it. If somebody is, because CSAM is easy to, by the way, so when we're talking about CSAM, it's illegal. So generally speaking, anybody that complains about CSAM being removed on them is probably the stupidest person in the whole world, all right? And thankfully they will get caught because if they've just flagged their own identity. But I would say completely go at them through the processes of law enforcement. And one thing I didn't say in my presentation was that for a hotline to exist, it must have the full support of law enforcement, government, child welfare, and industry. So, and that means more than just sort of tacit, it means having memorandums of understanding. And so if that was a hotline, the first thing would happen would be onto the police like a shot, okay? And that would be, so I would just say, to bring it short, I would just return it straight back at them and full rigor of the law and not be afraid of it.
Thank you, Denton. There's another one here that I think perhaps Richard might be able to help with, because it's more kind of general, particularly around health. And it says, given the online content moderation is a universal issue, what role should our governments have in recognizing these roles and providing resources to support them? And I think, we can reflect on, the whole mental health and support, all the work that you do. What's your advice on that, Richard?
Well, I certainly think at that level of government and in the UK, the Department of Health and Social Care need to start understanding the way people are working now and what impacts that has, because I think one of the issues I imagine for lots of people working in the space is if they do have access to a professional who then doesn't understand their work, that's going to make it much more difficult. So yeah, I absolutely think if we're going to really flourish in the digital age and understand all the roles and that, we need to really grasp that at every level, including adapting our health services and upskilling professionals to have better conversations, to be more responsive, because I know it can be really difficult. So yeah, absolutely. But it's also then about thinking about the context of employment law and our rights as individuals, in terms of the stress of the workplace, and bringing that into the thinking as well.
Thank you, Richard. And I'm so glad that we're making all this noise today. There's another one that I think perhaps Denton, I'm sorry, I keep coming back to you, might help. You talked about all different levels of, education. You have people with PhDs, you have people with A-levels working as content moderators. And these questions ask, how much do you feel that there is a sense of that moderation is low skill and low cost work, which then impacts on the level of resource and support moderators are given?
Okay, sorry, you said low skill and low, what was the second thing you said?
Low skill and low cost work, because as we know, a lot of companies go outside to source content moderators because it's cheaper.
Well, I can't speak for companies and outsourcing, because Hollins don't outsource, we are the endpoint. Okay, so we don't define what each of the hotlines must do, but when I said the point about education, okay, I don't mean that in a bad way. People would have had experience and life experience, so we didn't take somebody who was on a dumper truck one day and then working in a hotline the next as an analyst. But people have ended up in careers not necessarily with a full academic and formal qualification. They have lived through the experience, they may have started in a junior role and thus built their experience. So they may only have not even a high school education, okay? So but the point here is that there is a spectrum of knowledge. Now, I can't speak about the low cost scenario in industry, because that's not something I have any hands-on experience. I read what you read. But what I can tell you is it is definitely a high skill. In our world, it's extremely highly skilled, because we have to work in a hotline as an analyst. We have certain technologies you have to know how to use. You have to have certain abilities in terms of assessing and training, and pass that training. You have to get certified. Your hotline has to get certified. So we have online training modules that you must pass on. So like we set the bar quite high. Not necessarily that you must have the big important piece of paper with a very fancy seal on it, but it is required that you must have the verified ability to do that job. And also, and I will say this, a lot of it is personality, because while you can have the technical skills to do that job, and one of the things you mentioned, low skills, low cost, but there is that as it's a camp, but there are certain things. One of the things you must have high empathy, all right, because if you didn't have high empathy, and you must have a high situational awareness, and also you must have sort of high esteem of both your colleagues and yourself, because you can't function properly. You won't last a minute, or well, a minute. You won't last a week at that job without all of those things. So I would kind of flip that question. So I can't speak for the outsourcing on the cost perspective of what industry does. So I've answered sort of half of your question.
That's fine. That's fine. I'm just reading up. There's so many other questions that I'm really sorry we don't have the time to answer them all. We'll try to address them separately after the webinar, because I'd like to move on to the second part of the webinar, where the CATS team will be presenting our key findings. This session is moderated by my colleague, Dr. Paul Blakely, from the University of New Haven, who's been working with the team on this project since its very inception. So over to you, Paul.
Thank you, Eleanor. Thank you to our previous speakers. And most importantly, I think, thank you all for joining us again today. As Eleanor said, my name is Paul Blakely, and I'm from the University of New Haven over in Connecticut in the United States. And I'm going to be moderating this section of today's event. As a reminder, you guys have been doing a very, very good job in the chat box. So if you have any questions throughout the next presentations, please do put them in there as we go along, and we'll have time to get to those, hopefully, some of them at least, at the end of the next two presentations. So without further ado, on that note, I'd like to begin by introducing my dear colleague, Dr. Ruth Spence, who's going to discuss some of the findings of this project, particularly related to the impact that this profession has on the people who keep things running online, those content moderators that we have been talking about. Ruth is a senior research fellow at the Center for Abuse and Trauma Studies, CAPS, at Middlesex University, with a particular expertise and interest in trauma. She also happens to be the project manager of this Invisible Risks research team. So she is across a lot of the data and a lot of the research we've been doing so far, and we'll be able to speak to some of that. As I said, I'm not going to take any more of your time. Please take it away, Ruth.
Thanks for the intro. Yeah, so as everyone said, I'm going to be talking about some of what we've found in our study, with a particular focus on the effects of the work on the content moderators who are doing it. You'll probably find there's quite a lot of echoes back to what Andy was talking about throughout this. If you want to move on to the next slide. So we had two phases to our research. So we had a qualitative phase where we interviewed 11 content moderators. So 2 of them were ex-content moderators, but still reviewed content in their current role. And then we also had a quantitative phase where we sent out a study to as many content moderators as we could, and we had over 200 respond. You'll see that in both phases, there was slightly more females than males, but we had a pretty good mix. And again, about 60% in both phases came from the UK and Europe. During the interviews, we didn't ask for any sort of personal details, but in the survey, the mean age of respondents was 34, and the average length of time in the job was just over 4 years. If you could go to the next slide. So to take part in an interview, you had to have experience of moderating CSAM material, whereas for the survey, we just wanted as many content moderators to respond as possible. So that was the only criteria, that they were currently a content moderator. although you'll see that the majority of content moderators had CSAM experience in the survey. The most common type of exposure was seeing hate speech, but about 50% of our respondents also were exposed to extreme pornography, gore, graphic violence, and other types of child abuse. If you can go on to the next slide. We also asked during the survey about the psychological symptoms experienced using the Core 10, which is a standardized measure of psychological distress. So questions on that include things about anxiety, trouble sleeping, feeling unhappy, and hopelessness. Under 10% of our respondents scored in the healthy range, and over a third scored from moderate to severe psychological distress. So to put that into a bit of context, if you're scoring in that range, that would be clinical range, and you would be sort of recommended to see a therapist or a GP, something like that. If you can go to the next slide. We also asked respondents about their symptoms of secondary traumatic stress. So this is something that occurs after repeated or extreme exposure to aversive details of traumatic events, and is common in helping professions such as first responders and social workers. So the sorts of professionals that have to bear witness to other people's trauma, either through witnessing it themselves or hearing about it later. Symptoms include intrusive thoughts about the trauma, avoidance, so avoiding triggers like people, places that maybe will trigger memories of the trauma, and then cognitive and emotional effects, so anger, negative beliefs, feeling detached, and then also hyperarousal, so sleep disturbance, and hypervigilance, which is where you scan your environment for threats. If you can go to the next slide. So for our scale of secondary trauma, the higher you scored, the more symptoms that you were endorsing, or the more strongly you were saying that those symptoms occurred for you. And about 10% or just under 10% scored in the top third of our scale, which suggests that they are experiencing quite a few symptoms of secondary trauma. You can go to the next slide. We also asked about well-being. Just over a quarter of the moderators in the survey said that they had low well-being, although you can see there that the vast majority had medium well-being. So again, to try and put it into a bit of context, the average score for moderators was lower than that of the average score of the UK population, but you could see there it was 22 versus 23, so not that much. If you can go to the next slide. And then drilling down into the sort of negative impacts. So we, during the interviews, negative cognitive effects came out when talking to moderators. So again, there was thoughts of CSAM during their downtime, and they could be triggered by acts of physical intimacy, and they also dreamed about them. And then there was also evidence of cynicism, both towards the world. So there was talk of things like, my eyes have been opened, I no longer live in a bubble. But then also cynicism about people. So the idea that you didn't know who was looking at CSAM, and how could you know who was doing it? You know, maybe it was your friends, maybe it was your family. And then also views around children. And again, I think Andy touched on this idea that maybe if you walked past a playground, you would look at the children in terms of victims, and you'd be very aware of safety for children and how the internet could be a very dangerous place. And here's someone talking about how they wanted to avoid children. I don't want to be around children, especially if they're older than 8. I'm happy to know they exist. I'm happy to know that some of my friends are parents for the first time. I just do not want to meet the child or interact with said child. If you could go to the next slide. So again, we asked in the survey about some of these negative effects. Just over 60% said that they thought about distressing material at home. Just under a third disagreed that the world is a good place. And just under a quarter said that most people are not trustworthy. And there's a quote there about some of the effects of viewing this material. So that was quite disturbing for that moment. Yes, I did take about 2 or 3 days off from the work after that. I was not physically ill. It was just immediate that I couldn't take my head from that. So if you can go to the next slide. And then another area was the emotional toll of the work. So feelings of anxiety. And here someone said, sometimes I feel not exactly nervous, but like my body is very awake, but not in the sense of not being tired, more like being a little, maybe shaking a little, but not shaking on the inside, more like nervous, but without a reason when I see very much content or content that is very disturbing. And there was also talk of anger and feeling sad. Again, I think Andy sort of mentioned the physical effects of like fatigue, feeling drained, and there's also sleep disturbance. So either trouble falling asleep or staying asleep or not wanting to be asleep in the first place. And then there is a distance in relationships. So the idea that people couldn't understand what they'd been through and how it affected them. And that some people felt like their teammates were the only people that really could talk about with these things. Can you go to the next slide? So here's someone saying, I understand now that I can feel the way I feel around them, her teammates, but now there's people, I find it hard to be able to feel the way I feel when there's people not understanding any of it. And again, in the survey, we asked about the emotional toll of the job. Almost a third said they found it hard to stay positive and optimistic. 40% had trouble sleeping, and just over 40% said that they didn't feel connected to others. If you can go to the next slide. So that's kind of a whirlwind tour that show that content moderators experience relatively high levels of distressing psychological symptoms, secondary trauma, and negative cognitive beliefs. However, many of the content moderators did seem to cope reasonably well. So if you think over half felt only were experiencing mild or lower psychological distress, and the majority had medium well-being. So there are people that are coping reasonably well, but we need to make sure that support is in place to ensure the resilience of all workers, not those that are already able to cope. And again, I think Andy sort of touched on this with the longer term consequences. You know, we still don't know what that could be, not only when people just stop, but if people are doing this job for a year, 5 years, 20 years, we just don't know. And also what makes some more resilient than others, and what is the best way to support moderators. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Ruth. Appreciate it. And you know, obviously some great content there, and we'll hopefully get back to that with a few of the questions that are already rolling in. So thank you to the attendees for sending those through. Just a reminder, we will have time for questions at the end, and so please keep them coming, and we'll try to get to as many as possible. For now, though, we have another presenter from our CATS team, and let me introduce Paula Bradbury. Paula is a lecturer in criminology and policing practice at Middlesex University, and she is a senior researcher at the Centre for Abuse and Trauma Studies. Paula has some broad expertise in the study of online harms, and today, specifically, she's going to be delivering some of our project's findings, particularly related to how leadership in the content moderation field may have knock-on impacts for frontline content moderators. I know this is something that a few people in the chat have already been asking about, and so I'll let you speak to some of these issues, Paula. Paula, go forward. The floor is yours.
Hello, I just want to echo again, thank you everyone for turning up today to listen to our webinar and our findings from our project. So I'm going to be talking to you about some of the findings, specifically from our interviews with content moderators, in which we look at addressing their perspectives on positive and effective leadership in the workplace. So before I start, I'm just going to recap quickly on the methodology that we used for this approach. So if you could just, next slide, please. So this was part of our study to examine how workers were affected by viewing harmful images online. And one of the sections which we explored was a focus on effective and positive leadership experiences and methods. So as we've already been informed by Ruth, that we interviewed 11 content moderators. And from those interviews, we conducted some thematic analysis to identify the most prevalent themes. So if you could next slide, please. So one of the first things we talked about was we asked the content moderators to talk about what positive and effective leadership would look like in relation to their role. So the most commonly discussed behaviour was the creation of sort of empathetic environments, which Denton's already alluded to the importance of, where leaders are supportive and creating these spaces for engagement with content moderators to listen, to understand their concerns in a face-to-face environment that could be in and outside of the office. Content moderators also refer to the importance of being appreciated by their leadership teams. So to be told about how they are valued and what they are doing is making a significant difference in the world. And that was really treasured by those who were in the roles and viewing this content. Probably the third most and most sort of, there was different contexts in which people talked about an understanding of the role in relation to experience, but overall content moderators really wanted their line managers and the leadership team to have an understanding of what content moderation was, what their role entailed, and how challenging it can be. I've put here just some of the quotes that relate to these three top themes that were addressed, which clearly indicate the want for content moderators to engage with their leadership, for a coaching and caring and empathetic environment to be established. So next slide, please. So the second area we looked at was what they wanted more of from leadership. So first thing that they sort of identified was they were really having a yearning for increased opportunities for networking, and that was to engage with other content moderators locally or internationally. And this was to feel as if they were a part of professional community in which their role is aligned to. So it was about decreasing any sense of role isolation. And so they always felt that anybody who had the opportunity to attend these events, like the In Hope events, that they gained a significant amount from that and value for their role. Another thing they really wanted was considerably more feedback. And that was not necessarily about the mistakes that happened, but they really wanted to know about things that had gone specifically well, or any particular success stories which they find extremely motivating in order to continue doing the hard jobs that they do. Finally, there was discussion around increased training opportunities. Like all people in employment, there is content moderators really wanted to have the opportunity to engage and personally develop as professionals within their career as content moderators, and also to feel more confident about what they do and what they face. So next slide, please. And then sort of finally, the area we were looking at was the strongly discussion theme was around teams. And this was prevalent throughout all the interviews to quite a significant volume, and the importance of leadership in encouraging, developing teams within their workplaces. Content moderators voiced that they were significantly reliant on their team members for their psychological well-being and their general day-to-day enjoyment of their roles. And being around a team, they found extremely supportive, especially when having to talk about some of the things they found difficult that day, because they would have someone that would understand around them. By having a good established team, content moderators felt that they were given the opportunity to be open. Whilst they have the access to therapeutic support, being around a team members who understood the working environment, the pressures, the sort of content they were viewing, they found that this gave them the opportunity to discuss it in a more open context and relieve some of the pressures that they were experiencing. And finally, 7 out of the 11 participants commented on how they felt that their team, once it had been really established, provided almost a sense of a second family, that they had become very quite protective of each other and supporting each other within their environment. And this was a really strong emphasis on something they really valued in their workplace. But the underlying theme for all of these was a lot of it was about communication, and the team and also the leadership helped facilitate that. Final slide, please. So in conclusion, the recommendations that we established from this part of the analysis of the interviews was that content moderators really want leaders who understand and appreciate the nature of their work and feel supported should they find a particular piece of footing distressful. Encouraging leaders to spend time with their content moderators, not just in the office, but outside of it, to engage and develop a relationship with them so they could speak to them more freely. Have hires that understand content moderation and have experience was also another factor was really valued. Not to be a hidden role, to be encouraged to network with the content moderators, but also not to be a hidden role within the organization itself. To provide more feedback where possible, what goes well, not just gone wrong. And this might be in part of the investigations or something that the leaders have thought these individuals have done particularly well in managing difficult cases. Greater opportunities for training, for professional development, so they could have career advancements opportunity and also explore and develop their own sense of professionalization in their career. And then finally, emphasis on building the right team, because this was very, very clear, the importance of the team and having good working people around you to support you and understand and be open with was extremely important in order to be managing someone's own well-being and their ability to function within their roles. So I think that's next slide. So thank you very much. Those are the findings from this phase in the thematic interview analysis.
Awesome. Thank you, Paula. Very interesting findings, and we'll get to probe those a little bit more in this Q&A session. So thank you for that. We do have some time for questions, which is awesome to ask of Ruth and Paula. I'll just say to the attendees, if you do have questions, please do put them in the Q&A chat box and we will get to as many as we can. But let me kick things off. Ruth, we're going straight back to you. And this is kind of a summary of a few questions that I've seen popping up, both during the time that you were speaking and also the time that our previous panelists were speaking, our guest speakers were talking. And I guess what this really comes back to is you spoke a lot about the impacts of the job, right? And I wanted to know a little bit more about what kind of coping strategies were discussed, if any, you know, whether those are coping strategies that are maybe informal, like certain things like Andy was talking about previously, or even more formal coping strategies that might be in place. Was there any discussion of that?
Yeah, so we did actually ask the moderators during the interviews about their coping strategies. And again, this sort of echoes back to what Andy was saying, that there was a number of strategies that they used, and they sort of broke down into what they found helpful that the organization did, which again, we'll probably touch on a bit of what Paula was talking about. In particular, the like mandatory therapy, but it had to be with people that understood what the job entailed. So some people got therapy, but they didn't find it that useful because the therapists themselves didn't know about CSAM, didn't know about the effects of CSAM, and so there was a sort of disconnect there, if you will. I think moderators, they seem to come up with a lot of sort of self-help ones where there is like minimizing the images as much as possible, trying to look at content without any sound on. But then there was also sort of informal ones. So we had a lot of talk about exercise. I think that's probably to do with helping your mind get distracted, but also taking your mind off things. So I think it gets into like a flow state where you can just put everything else behind you. And I think a key one, and I think I saw someone ask sort of about this with working from home, was putting boundaries in place. So I think it was Denton that said that they enforced a half-hour break at the end of their working day. And I think that's the sort of very key one for people, is to make sure that your home life and your work life are as separated as possible. Even if you're working from home, putting in some sort of artificial boundary of like, at the end of my working day, I go for a walk and do something else, and then that marks that as a finish. So yeah, I think again there was lots like distraction and talking as well, talking to colleagues, again echoing Andy there. That was key. Like that was just, as Paula said as well, they became a second family, and I think that was just the people that they went to help them to understand what they were seeing, but also to get that understanding back.
Thanks, Ruth. Awesome. And thank you for answering the question about work from home as well. That was going to be my follow-up to you. So you've already covered that, which is great. I just want to maybe pivot a little bit. Richard, if you're still with us, I think this is something that that would be obviously in your sphere of expertise, and I just want to know if you had anything you might want to add about potential coping strategies for content moderators and what might be effective.
I think I've been interested in research on burnout, which has come from Scandinavia, where looking at what was helpful in therapy. There were two elements that seemed to be really helpful, and this is, thinking of chronic stress and burnout before people get to the trauma impacting further. And one was being able to sleep effectively. So things that help you have a better quality of sleep. And the other was, and I think this goes back to Paula's point about feedback, really, helping to understand the effectiveness of what you're doing. So feeling that personal efficacy, both of those seem to be the factors that really help people recover from burnout. I think there's still more work to be done, and probably around what we might call behavioral activation, where you actually still do the things in life that you find rewarding as well, because again, people tend to withdraw and isolate themselves. But I can't help at this point, Paul, without saying, I thought Paula's emphasis on the importance of leadership, and thinking particularly of that category of moral injury, where it is really difficult when you feel the people in positions of leadership neither understand or support what's happening. So I just want to throw the organizational aspect in at the end, but sleep and getting feedback to understand your effectiveness can be really protective.
Fantastic. Thank you, Richard. And I'm just looking at the question and answer box here, and Michael, who's one of our attendees, mentions one coping mechanism he personally used was using only viewing particular content on a specific screen. So then going back there to things like, I guess, compartmentalization and stuff like that, which is also showing up. It's just fantastic. Thank you for adding that, Michael. In terms of what Richard was saying about organizational culture and leadership, I think we're going to turn back to you, Paula. You mentioned a lot of perspectives from content moderators about what makes for effective leadership, for lack of a better term. And I just wanted to know from you if there was anything really in that research, in those findings, that surprised you personally, you might not have thought of going in.
Yeah, I think there was such a wealth of information in regard to what content moderators really found useful and supportive in their roles. And we've touched on it as well within like the key speakers today, was looking at factors such as within the leaders, whilst the content moderators wanted their leaders to have an understanding of their role and a degree of experience, they weren't asking them to sit by their sides and watch it with them. They wanted them to have that solid recognition of what it is they're undertaking and what they are bearing in their jobs. And that sense of compassion, understanding and empathy was really treasured by the content moderators. So it wasn't about sitting side by side and seeing the images with them. It's about walking with them through their experience as employees, and holding their hand and just saying that I've got your back, was incredibly important. That, and I think the importance of having skill set and experience was also very, very valued. So you could have great skills, but it has to be the right skill set in order to lead people in such a difficult environment and traumatic environment. So those were some of the really powerful ones, as well as the relationships, which I didn't expect as well, but the importance of relationships in the workplace, like Richard was just saying, that was another real key significant take home.
Fantastic. Thank you, Paula. And I think it'd probably be a good idea, Andy, if you're still with us. You've obviously been on the front lines in the trenches, so to speak, and I'm sure you have some opinions on what makes for effective leadership in this field. So I just wanted to maybe draw on your experience and see if you had anything you wanted to add.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Paul. Well, obviously it varies from place to place, and I think leadership is a unique skill, I think, to be honest. And when we're dealing with harmful content, I think maybe there are some places where if you were to be a manager, it's great if you've got managerial skills or you've been a manager before. But when we're dealing with this, to have a true knowledge an understanding of the content as well. And that will help you understand what the content moderator is doing. So if they do need help and they do need advice, that manager will truly understand it. So, you know, maybe that needs to be potentially looked at in some places, you know, because you do need a full understanding. And, you know, as people have said before, you know, that would help you understand, you know, being sympathetic and stuff like that towards it. So maybe, you know, there needs to be more enhanced training or knowledge in certain key managerial positions, maybe.
Fantastic, thanks, Andy. And then it sounds like from what Paula was saying earlier, this is something that is shining through in the research. You know, that ability for management to both be effective but also empathise with the job and the stresses of said job. We're going to go back to the chat box now, and I think this next one is probably for you, Ruth. So this is from Maria, and Maria's asking. She says this is really important to learn more about the issues in content moderators like sleep disturbances and whatnot. And she asked if we have comparable data on the general population, you know, like what is the percentage of people in general who have sleep disturbances and how content moderators fit into that framework, and if we had any information on that.
I think that's a really good question. And it's one that we tried to address by getting a control group. We wanted to get social workers to also complete so that we could, because you're right, it's all very well saying this percentage have sleep disturbance, but if you have nothing to compare that against, it's slightly harder to know what it means. And unfortunately, the honest answer is I cannot tell you that at the moment. I haven't looked into those figures. I'm sure they're out there. And as I say, we did try and get a comparison group, but it didn't work out for reasons that I won't bore you all with at the moment. But we could certainly see, yeah, that's a really good idea to try and see what's out there, open source data. And then maybe the next time we present, they will be in there.
Sounds good. Watch your space, folks. And I'm going to ask one last question. We have time for one more. And I think the last question that came through is actually probably the best one to end on, actually. And the question asks, from an anonymous attendee, as someone who's supporting content moderators currently, what else can we do to understand the role, and what might help us build trust so that we can be alongside and work alongside content moderators? And I'll open that to whoever wants to answer it. Maybe you, Paula, if you want to kick us off really quickly.
I mean, literally, it's talking to content moderators. I think one of the ways in which, you know, sort of engaging and understanding the experience of what people are going through, first and foremost, is to ask people with the lived experience. And by doing things like we're doing today, where we're getting everybody the opportunity to have these open discussion platforms, I think that's a real significant step forward in the transparency of these roles.
Fantastic. Thank you, Paula. That sounds great. That's great advice. Ruth, did you want to add something as well?
I feel like all I'm doing today is saying, as somebody else said, but yeah, as Paula said, I mean, I think it is that you just have to talk to them. I don't think anyone would advocate that they have to sit down and do the job with them, but talk to them and find out about their experiences and ask them how can they be best supported. And I think, again, what Paula raised, feedback of showing them what a good job they're doing, pointing out what they've done well, how they're making a difference. I think that can really help.
Fantastic. Fantastic. I would like to thank both of you, Paula and Ruth, for delivering those results, which are incredibly interesting. And as I said earlier, watch this space, right? There's much more to come as we keep moving forward. For now, though, we are out of time for questions. If you do have any further questions, please do feel free to send them through to our group, and we'll do our best to answer them. But for now, I'd like to hand back to Elena Martellozzo to bring us towards a conclusion.
Thank you, Paul. I'm grateful, and thank you, Paul and Ruth, for your very clear presentations. I'd like to add to that last question that, yes, talking is great, but I think also empathy towards the work that they do. I have been working in child protection for nearly 20 years, and I've always valued the work that content moderators do, but not as much as I do now after I've done this work and after I've spent time researching their roles and their dedication and their passion to really keep the internet a clean and safe place. So thank you for that. I'm conscious of time, and I promised that I would try to share as my best ability. And I'd like to pass it on back to Professor Antonio Bifulco, who will be concluding the webinar.
Thank you, Eleanor. That's been really fascinating. The first point I want to make is just what Jeffrey would have spoken about, which is the fact that the next stage of our research is going to be, or is in the process of designing some intervention. So, you know, having collected all this information, we are going to try and provide something that will help content moderators. And what we envisage is a platform, an online platform that work eventually across organizations, and it will be self-serve, and it will be about psychological support. And we're deriving the areas from the research and providing sort of practical tips, not too psychologically worded maybe, but just regular practical tips around well-being, providing information and for self-awareness. And we're starting with sort of 3 core modules that have come out of the research, and I've heard people talk about today. One is sleep, which seems to be quite a big issue, anxiety and well-being. And we're not inventing brand new techniques. These are all available, but we are trying to gear them towards content moderators and hope that they will be instituted within their organizations. I know from what we've heard in Hope, and I know Richard's work and others have already got such interventions, but the idea is to have general access across organizations so people can feel they have somewhere to go if they're being stressed in their jobs, but also that their organization is trying to offer them something. And we'll give you more information on that as it progresses. But in terms of concluding this webinar, firstly, it's been fascinating to me and very informative, and thank you to all the speakers for your excellent presentations and comments, and to the attendees for their really good questions. What has come through to me is that when people hear about this field, they think it's all going to be about technology, complicated technology, AI. But what I'm hearing is that this is about people. And we need to just make sure they're kept in the picture, the people behind the technology and working with it. And the practitioners, from what has been said earlier, are working with material that's been compared to toxic waste and have to make decisions that are like air traffic controllers. So this is all very complex and difficult processing needed. In addition to that, it can involve moral injury, which is a sort of fairly recent concept, I think, in psychology, but it's about material that really offends your values and sense of what's right and wrong, and for which you may feel some responsibility, in the sense if you're working to take this down and you miss one, or you're worried about missing one. So it's also this sense that you might feel responsible. And yet we're saying the people that should go into this field must have high empathy. So you can see how their skill set will make this particularly challenging in many ways. I think another thing that's come up is the issue of boundaries. And it seems to me that we have to develop in our society the sense of balance. So a balance between what's online and offline. So we develop appropriate boundaries ourselves between those two, but also between work and life balance, and that affects all of us, not just people who are content moderators, but also I would say between the inner psychological world and the outer socio-environmental world, that, you know, what we see outside affects us inside, and we just have to keep some boundaries and safeguards on that. I think in the context of all this, the label of content moderator is really quite bland if you compare it to something like a firefighter. And I think people don't always get from that what it is that people are working on, and how complex and how important it is. And I think we really do need good recognition for this as a for these practitioners as a profession, and this should be reflected in recruitment, retention, promotion, etc. So I think what we've heard today as important messages for policy, for practice, for research, as somebody who is a researcher, I would reiterate it's really important to have evidence-based findings, and this is what we're trying to add to this, but also to give a voice to content moderators so that they can be heard and that we can disseminate their views and feelings in order that policymakers and organisations can hear that. At the end of the day, this is about occupational health, really. It's about how people can be safe at work while they're protecting other people to be safe online. And we've heard about issues of leadership in organisations and recognition of what workers are going through. And I think if all these messages can get out, then hopefully we will affect some positive change in the future. So thank you to everybody for attending and for speaking, and let's take this forward.
Thank you, Tony. Thank you, everybody, for attending. Sorry we went a couple of minutes over time. You've got our links, our website. Please do follow us on Twitter and LinkedIn, and we will share more findings as the research progresses. Thank you all, and I look forward to speaking to you all soon. Bye-bye.